This video contains images of wounds and infections from World War I.
Hello, and welcome to this history tutorial on the British sector of the Western Front. This is for Edexcel GCSE History, Medicine in Britain. Today we will cover the conditions in the trenches and the illness that this may cause, and we will also examine the types of wounds and injuries that soldiers may suffer from on the Western Front. Life in the trenches exposed soldiers to a lot of illnesses and infections. Trench foot, trench fever and shell shock were all conditions that were caused by the poor trench conditions. Trench foot was a condition that was caused by standing in flooded trenches for too long. The skin and tissue on the feet broke down and it could become gangrenous. Once gangrene had set in, the only way to stop the infection was to amputate the infected limb. Trench foot was a condition that was more common at the start of the war. By 1915, there were fewer cases as soldiers changed their socks more regularly, and they also put whale oil on their feet to create a waterproof layer. Infections such as dysentery were also very common in the trench environment. Dysentery was caused by dirty water and unhygienic toilets and caused diarrhea and dehydration amongst the soldiers. Trench fever was yet another condition that was caused by the trench environment. The trenches were full of rats, lice, maggots and flies. Trench fever was actually caused by body lice. Soldiers would suffer from flu-like symptoms with a high temperature, headaches and aching muscles. It is estimated that trench fever affected 500,000 soldiers on the Western Front. It wasn't until 1918 that doctors made the link between lice and trench fever. After this, delousing stations were set up to try and stop outbreaks of the disease, but they weren't always successful. It was incredibly difficult to remove lice eggs from the soldiers' clothes. Trench warfare could also cause emotional trauma. In the trenches, soldiers were exposed to lots of death, destruction and artillery bombardment. Living in these harsh conditions could cause a psychological illness called shell shock. Symptoms of shell shock could include tiredness, blindness, hearing loss, shaking and mental breakdown. Many soldiers that suffered from this condition were accused of cowardice. It is estimated that 80,000 British soldiers experienced this. As well as the conditions and illnesses caused by living in the trenches, trench warfare also caused horrific injuries on a scale doctors had not seen before the war. Soldiers were often wounded by gunfire and shell explosions. Machine guns and rifles caused gunshot wounds, bruises, fractured bones and organ damage. A case study of 200,000 wounded men treated at casualty clearing stations on the Western Front found that bullets were responsible for 39% of wounds. Trenches often protected the body, but the head was exposed. The army were alarmed at the number and severity of head injuries. They saw injuries like shrapnel embedded in the brain, skull fractures, large scalp cuts and brain damage. In 1915, the metal Brodie helmets were issued. It was estimated that it reduced fatal head wounds by 80%, so the helmet was then provided to all soldiers fighting on the Western Front. Shrapnel, metal objects and fragments from explosions, caused horrific facial injuries and could kill instantly. High explosive shells and shrapnel were responsible for 58% of wounds on the Western Front. Shrapnel shells were blown open in the air using a small fuse. They were filled with bullets and metal balls which flew out and hit soldiers. Other shells were designed to explode violently. The cases of these high explosive shells broke into large jagged pieces of shrapnel that tore through the flesh. A big problem on the Western Front, which was difficult to overcome, was the problem of wound infection. Many trenches were dug in farmland which was covered in bacteria from fertilisers. The ground was also infected by unhygienic toilets and thousands of bodies that were left to decompose or were buried in shallow graves near the trenches. Wounded men often had to lie in contaminated mud for hours or days before being picked up by stretcher bearers. They were at risk of getting serious infections like tetanus and gas gangrene. Both conditions were fatal without treatment. Infections could also cause sepsis. The impact of tetanus was reduced by the use of an anti-tetanus injection from the end of 1914. However, there was no cure for gas gangrene. The bacteria for gas gangrene spread throughout the body quickly and could kill a person within a day. Gas was a new weapon used during World War I, and the effects of gas could be devastating. Chlorine gas was the first deadly gas used on the Western Front. It was a killing agent that slowly suffocated its victims. Phosgene gas was also used from December 1915. This caused suffocation. The gas itself had a mild scent and was colourless, so it was hard to detect. It could take over 24 hours for symptoms to set in. From July 1917, mustard gas was introduced into the war. This was a blistering agent that caused blisters, burning, and breathing difficulties. Extended exposure to mustard gas could cause blindness and lung infections. It ate away at the body from the inside and could take up to 5 weeks to die. The gas could cling to clothes for hours, which put medical staff at risk too. Gas attacks caused great panic and fear. It was not, however, a major cause of death, with only about 6,000 British soldiers dying as a result of gas. The British Army gave troops from the Western Front gas masks from 1915, which became more sophisticated over time. Still, gas attacks were greatly feared by soldiers on the Western Front. In summary, life in the trenches led to several illnesses and conditions: trench fever, trench foot, and shell shock. The most common wounds and injuries occurred as a result of shrapnel and bullet wounds. Arguably, the biggest issue on the Western Front was wound infection. When men were injured, either by shrapnel or by bullets, the metal would penetrate their body, taking with it the fabric of the uniform from the area surrounding the wound. The soil in the region, which had been intensively farmed with large quantities of fertiliser before the war, contained the bacteria for both tetanus and gas gangrene, both of which were fatal. To get further help, visit history.outwood.com, see your teacher in school, or check out quiz.outwood.com for those sweet revision quizzes. You can also follow the Outwood Humanities team on Twitter @OGATHumanities. Until next time, that was a little bit of history.